Okay, so we've talked about these tropical environments in Africa, and that has an impact on the type of agriculture that is there, that is dominant. So we have primarily people feed themselves by subsistence agriculture, which is where you grow the food for your own family or community. And so, like we've mentioned, that soils in tropical regions can be unproductive when the vegetation is cleared. So that's why you have shifting agriculture, because you have to keep kind of moving to different places to keep growing your food. Some of the major crops include corn, yams, bananas, manioc. One thing noticeably absent is wheat, because wheat does not often do well in these tropical environments. A second important part of agriculture in Africa is pastoralism, or herding animals. Some people, like the Maasai shown here, live almost exclusively on their cattle. So cattle, other grazing animals are an important part. So here, this is showing where you have subsistence agriculture, and primarily shifting cultivation. This darker color up here is where nomadic herding or pastoralism is important. You also have plantations in parts of Africa, especially along West Africa, for things like for cocoa and other products, coffee. And as you get further south, it's a little bit more like agriculture you would find in California, Mediterranean farming. So this is showing subsistence agriculture in Africa, people growing food. This photo kind of maybe shows it a little better because it's more complete. You have both subsistence agriculture, growing corn and other products, and also pastoralism of herding animals both for their meat and for the dairy. These are the Maasai people in Eastern Africa who live nearly exclusively on their cattle. They use the milk, and also even sometimes they use the blood of the animal as a food product. This figure from the book is showing grazing pins that the Maasai they use fire to clear out pins to hold their animals. All right, we've also talked about we've mentioned in the introduction the Green Revolution. So we have with the Industrial Revolution, technologies and trade changed agriculture, and in many parts of the world, it's transitioned from subsistence agriculture to commercial or industrial agriculture. The idea that you grow more food and make higher profits. And so Africa has been impacted by that as well. So some issues related to agriculture include land tenure. Land tenure is how people use or own the land. And there are different traditions in Africa than in, say, Europe. In Africa, there's a longer tradition of communal use, so communal gardens, for example, where multiple families would grow food in a communal area. Whereas Europe and the Americas is a stronger tradition of private land, that this is my farm and that's your farm, and I grow my food here and you grow your food there. So there are different traditions of these are examples of land tenure, and some of these traditions can come into conflict. For example, with the Europeans coming into Africa, you had many examples of land alienation where colonial powers would come in and make some sort of agreements, that people that really hustling people out of their land. So this is really either by brute force or by trickery, confiscating land from people and reducing the amount of land that communities had available to grow their own food. And that was true during the colonial period, but it continues to be true because of of agribusiness companies, big corporate farming, who sometimes will make agreements with governments and be able to use large parts of the country for export-oriented farming. So this is considered now a form of neo-colonialism or new colonialism, where rather than a country coming in and taking over part of Africa. You have big corporations that are kind of bribing their way in and exploiting resources. This is showing the percent of cropland. This is kind of at this along the Sahel. The Sahel is quite productive. Lower here in the tropical rainforest areas because of the poor soil quality, and a bit higher as you kind of get out of that belt. And we've also discussed how the different economic sectors, the primary, which is agriculture, secondary, more manufacturing, and tertiary, which are services. And we've talked about how in North America that most people work in the tertiary sector, but Africa is an example where there are a majority of the population work in the primary sector, agriculture, harvesting of goods, fishing. This lady is selling produce that she's harvested. She works in the primary sector. Probably the one thing that is notable in this picture is the cell phone. That in many parts of Africa that are very rural, landlines never were a thing, that there wasn't this massive amount of investment that went into creating telephone lines in the past. And so cell phone service is incredibly important for people to do business, access the internet, so on. So she may be working on a deal for her produce using this mobile cellular system. Fishing is also important in many parts of Africa along the coast, and fishing is also a primary industry. And increasingly, when it comes to the, the economics of Africa, that China has become increasingly involved in investing and kind of being sort of like a new colonial power. That China has a project called its Belt and Road Project, where it's expanding its economic influence into different parts of the world, and that includes Africa as well. So rather than having Europe and United States, which historically have been involved in African affairs, we're increasingly seeing the Chinese being involved as well. Chinese engagement with African countries is somewhat different than Europeans in the US. That China is where the US and European countries will often have requirements for democracy, free press, that type of thing. China less so, that it has a more hands-off or business-oriented approach to its engagement with these countries, less concerned with human rights or democracy. One thing about just generally on the economic geography of Africa is that it has a whole lot of natural resources, and that's what really drew European powers to Africa in the first place, is its variety of natural resources, including mineral wealth like gold, diamonds, especially in the south, various other things, and also oil. That there is a significant amount of oil, especially along this sort of this corner here of coastal Africa from Nigeria on down to Angola. And you have in some parts of Africa, you have a high rate of growth. We often think of Africa as being relatively poor to the rest of the world. And while that is true, when you have a poorer economy, you have much more room for growth. So with the US economy, it's really hard to grow it very fast because it's such a big economy already that a huge, it's really hard to kind of double that amount of growth. Whereas some of the countries have in sub-Saharan Africa have quite high rates of economic growth because of where they're starting from. And so that brings a lot of interest and investment in Africa because of the high rates of economic growth. And another thing that Africa really has going for it is its demographics, that unlike the demographic challenges of Europe and to the lesser extent the United States, Africa is a relatively young country. And so there's a lot of people that are working age, well educated, and so there's a ready workforce in Africa. So that's one of its economic advantages. One thing that makes that it's an economic difficulty in Africa is its sheer size. We often don't appreciate on maps how big it is, but just to fly from one side of Africa to the other here, it's like a 5 or 6 hour flight. From Cape Town up to Ethiopia, it's about a 7-hour flight. I mean, these are large distances. Also, railroads in the country were not designed to connect countries to each other. They were designed to extract resources. So while you do have railways, they don't often connect. They're not as well as at connecting Africa together as, say, railways in Europe.